My name is Charlotte Reed, an investigative journalist living in Chicago. For years, I exposed multi-million-dollar frauds, never imagining that one day my own family would become the center of the story I was forced to tell. The call came at 2 a.m., my sister's voice trembling as she told me our father had died of a heart attack. I dropped everything, my career, my life, and booked a one-way ticket back to my hometown of Cedar Springs without hesitation. But when I walked into the estate, the man I had just mourned was standing in his study, alive and perfectly calm. If someone in your family faked their own death just to get their hands on your money, what would you do? Forgive or fight back? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel if you've ever believed in the sacred bond of family, because now I'm going to tell you the truth they tried to bury. I don't remember how I managed to keep myself upright and not collapse right there. Seeing the father I had just cried over standing in front of me like nothing had happened was almost too much to bear. He didn't even look surprised to see me. If anything, his expression was somewhere between smugness and calculated control. "You're home," he said, like I'd only been gone a few weeks, not completely cut off from the family for nearly 7 years. Then I heard a small laugh behind me. It was Brittany. She let out a relieved little chuckle and walked over, linking her arm through mine as if everything was perfectly under control. "I was going to tell you as soon as Dad came to," she said, "but everything happened so fast. The doctor said it'd be better not to worry you." I pulled my arm away from hers. Didn't recognize them anymore. I used to think I was immune to manipulation. In my line of work, cold lies and performances were nothing new, but the way my family orchestrated this tragedy, pretending our father had died just to lure me home, made me realize something terrifying. I was never prepared for betrayal from my own blood. Years ago, when I refused to join Reed Holdings, I was labeled the traitor. The whole town looked at me like I'd turned my back on tradition, on family honor. I chose journalism, moved to Chicago, started over from scratch, and received absolutely no support from my father. He once told me, "People who work with words only know how to judge, not build. If you won't follow the family path, don't expect to keep your share." I was just 26 then, idealistic, but wounded. I gave up everything to live a life I believed in, and I thought I had made peace with the hurt until today, when I realized that wound had never really healed. I sat down on the old living room sofa, trying to stay calm. The room hadn't changed at all from my memories, the grandfather clock still ticking, my grandfather's portrait still hanging above the fireplace, the old floral rug still bearing a small scorch mark from the Christmas candle spill when I was 10. Only I had changed. "Why don't you sit and rest for a bit?" Brittany said gently. "You've had a long flight. We're planning a small memorial gathering tonight. Try not to stress too much." "A memorial for who?" I asked, staring directly at her. She flinched slightly, then smiled like she was forgiving me for being irrational. "You know I didn't mean to upset you. We panicked. The doctor said Dad had signs of cardiac arrest. Everyone thought we might lose him. Luckily, he pulled through." I didn't reply. I got up and walked toward the staircase to my old room. I needed space to think, to reclaim some control that had been ripped from me the second I stepped into this house. My room was untouched. The room of a daughter they once hoped would carry on the legacy. The comforter was still folded neatly, the desk spotless, even the old books I'd left behind were still in their place, as if I'd never left. Or worse, as if they'd been waiting, not out of love, but because one day I'd become necessary. I sat on the edge of the bed. The exhaustion wasn't from the flight. It came from the total collapse of everything I thought were memories. I thought about my mother. She passed away 5 years ago, also suddenly, also from a heart attack. I didn't make it home in time. No one even called me. There was no funeral, no text, just a cold email from an old friend saying, "I heard your mom passed. You okay?" I blamed myself for years, but now I wonder, was there something more? I pulled out my phone and reopened the anonymous email. The sender's address was scrambled through an encryption network, no signature, just one chilling line. He's not dead, but they want your trust fund. At the time, I thought it was a sick joke, but now I'm not so sure. My trust fund isn't small. After my grandfather, who was the only one who supported my career choice, passed away, he left me a portion of his estate, separate from the company and beyond my father's control. The only condition, I wouldn't gain full access until my 35th birthday. 18 months away. Not soon, but not far either. I suddenly remembered a winter night when I was about 14, sitting with my grandfather in his old study, warm yellow light spilling onto the wooden map on the wall. "Here will come a time, Charlotte," he said, "when you'll feel alone. Don't let that loneliness make you lose yourself, especially if it comes from those who share your blood." I didn't understand it then, but now I feel every word, and the lump rising in my throat is too heavy to speak through. I sat in that room for what felt like hours. Every sound from downstairs was muffled by layers of memories pressing in from all sides. Old photos on the wall, high school magazines with my first bylines. Everything made me feel like some part of me had been frozen here, locked in a place I once thought was safe. A soft knock came at the door. Without waiting for an answer, Brittany stepped in, carrying a tray with a blue china teacup, the one Mom used to serve me when I was sick. "I figured you could use something warm," she said softly, placing the tray down on the side table. I didn't respond, just stared at her. Everything about Brittany was always perfect. Her golden curls, sun-kissed skin, sweet voice straight out of a Connecticut debutante catalog. But her eyes weren't right. There was something misaligned behind that concern, like every gesture had been rehearsed. "You still seem upset," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed across from me. "I get it. But we didn't mean any harm. Dad did collapse. The doctor said it was a possible TIA. But at the time, I just thought, if we didn't use this chance to bring you home, there might never be another." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you told me he died?" My voice was low, tight. "You called me in the middle of the night, made me abandon work, cancel an interview I'd prepped for all month, spend my entire savings on a last-minute ticket just to witness this performance?" "Well, you didn't ask for a death certificate or talk to the doctors," Brittany offered, forcing a laugh. I didn't recognize the girl sitting in front of me anymore. "Tell me the truth," I said slowly. "What I got yesterday wasn't a cry for help, it was a setup." Brittany lowered her head, gently tracing the rim of her teacup, saying nothing. But her silence, to me, was more terrifying than any words could be. "We need you, Charlotte," she whispered after a moment. "Your assets. If you don't help, Reed Holdings will collapse. Our family will lose everything. Dad, Eric, even me. There'll be nothing left." I froze when she said Eric's name. My brother. I hadn't seen him all day, which was strange, because growing up, in every crisis, Eric was always the one standing out front. "Where is Eric?" I asked. "Hilmer went to meet with the lawyer," Brittany replied quickly. "There are some documents he needs to prepare. It's related to you, too." I turned my face away. I didn't want to hear any more. "I used to think I was used to betrayal," I said quietly. "But being trapped by your own family, that's different, Brittany. You have no idea." Brittany stood up, as if something inside her had been touched. "You think I didn't hurt too?" she said, her voice rising for the first time. "You walked away, you left everything behind. Mom and Dad had to pick up the pieces. I had to learn to work, to stand up, to carry the Reed name in your place. Now you come back and act like the victim. I lost something too, Charlotte." I watched her leave the room, her footsteps quick and heavy, as if she was the one who had been wronged. I buried my face in my hands, exhaustion hitting me in slow, heavy waves. The door closed softly behind her. I still remembered the look in Mom's eyes in the photo on the desk, her bright smile during the ribbon cutting of the first building to carry our family name. I had stood beside her that day, 12 years old, holding her hand tight. Back then, I believed family was the one thing that would never change. I was wrong. I went downstairs a little later and found my father sitting alone in his study. The desk lamp cast a warm glow across his face, deepening the lines more than I remembered. But his eyes, they hadn't changed. Still sharp, still cold, still calculating. "You came to talk?" he asked without looking up from the stack of papers. "Why did you do this?" I asked plainly. "I already walked away. You didn't have to drag me back with something this low." "Because you're part of this family," he replied flatly. "And because a part of the Reed legacy is in your hands. You can deny it all you want, but in the end, you came back. That says more than you think." "It wasn't for the family," I said. "It was because I thought you were dead. I still loved you, even if you didn't deserve it." For the first time, he looked at me. That stare chilled me to the bone. There wasn't even a flicker of remorse. "Good," he said. "Then you can prove it by signing the contract tomorrow. Let your assets work for the family. I'm not 35 yet, but you can authorize early access. One signature. That's all it takes." I stood there, saying nothing. In that moment, I was no longer the girl who'd been cast aside. No longer the daughter expelled for choosing a different path. I was the only one still clear-headed enough not to drown, and I was starting to realize I might be the one who would have to clean up the wreckage, not to save the family, but to stop them from dragging anyone else down with them. The next morning, I came downstairs early. The sun had just broken over the horizon, casting a pale golden light through the large dining room windows, spreading across the marble floor. The house was silent, as if all the tension from the day before had been sealed beneath a layer of stillness. I opened the fridge, took out the milk, poured it into a glass, and stood there, staring into the empty space ahead. There was a coldness inside me I couldn't shake. Like every warm memory this house once held had been replaced by fine cracks of manipulation. On the kitchen island, a thick stack of documents sat neatly, tied with a silver-gray ribbon. A small note was clipped on top, written in my father's unmistakable, precise handwriting, just like every contract he'd ever signed. "Take time to review carefully. Bernard will arrive at 10 o'clock. Bernard Quinn, the family attorney since I was in grade school. I used to call him Uncle Bernie when he came by with peppermint candy. Now he was the one sent to persuade me to willingly give up control of what was mine. I picked up the documents and went back to my room, sat down at the old desk still marked with the scratches where I'd carved my name with a paperclip. As I opened the folder, the scent of fresh ink and paper glue made my skin crawl. Page after page. Thick with clauses, amendments, adjustments. The legal language was dense, but the goal was clear. They wanted me to sign away the entire trust fund into Reed Innovations, a name that sounded new, but was just a hollow frame on the verge of collapse. One clause stood out to me, Section 14, subsection 3. It stated that once the assets were transferred, I would become a non-voting minority partner, and all restructuring authority would fall to the board, meaning my father, Eric, and an undisclosed stakeholder. I placed a hand on my forehead, trying to fight off the wave of nausea rising inside me. The trap was set perfectly, buried under layers of polished language and the noble pretense of "for the good of the family." At exactly 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I went downstairs and saw Bernard standing in the living room, holding his leather briefcase, dressed in a light gray suit, a small boutonniere on his lapel like he was headed to a wedding. "Charlotte, you look well," he said warmly, but his eyes scanned me, watching every move. "I know this is an emotional time, but trust me, what I've brought today is for your good, for the family, for everyone's future." I didn't reply. He sat down, opened his briefcase, and began his presentation in a steady, gentle tone, with just enough persuasion behind his lawyerly objectivity. Reed Holdings has seen tremendous growth over the past 3 years, thanks to our premium real estate projects across the East Coast and Midwest. But with rapid expansion, occasional cash flow issues are to be expected. It's normal in strategic investments. I stayed silent. He continued. "We have a fantastic opportunity to pivot into smart construction technologies, and your trust, if authorized early, would be the cornerstone. In return, you'd retain co-ownership status and receive dividend payouts if applicable. If applicable? I asked, eyes locked on his. Of course, every investment carries some risk, but given the company's current standing and the backing of our close investor network, you mean the loans from underground funds? I cut in. Bernard paused, but quickly redirected. Charlotte, this isn't the time for suspicion. Your family needs you. All it takes is one signature. I looked at him and felt like I was staring at a different version of the man who once carried me on his shoulders at my 7th birthday party. He was no longer the trusted family friend. Now, he was the guardian of a rotting system they had built. I sat there in silence while he continued to talk about opportunity, responsibility, reconciliation. Every word he said felt like a thread tightening around my throat, pulling tighter with every passing minute. Finally, I spoke quietly but clearly. I need time to review everything. Bernard nodded, though the disappointment on his face was obvious. Of course, but keep in mind, timing is everything in investment. Our partners are waiting for confirmation, and if there's no guarantee of cash flow by the end of this week, so if I don't sign, there will be consequences. It's not a threat, just a warning. Things are very fragile right now. He stood up, buttoned his blazer, and placed the pre-marked contract on the coffee table. You know the way forward, Charlotte. Don't let emotions take you away from your family again. I stared at his back as he walked out the door. In my mind, the puzzle pieces started to shift. Something was deeply wrong with the entire system. This fragile situation they kept mentioning. I had a feeling it wasn't just a cash crunch. It could be something far more serious, possibly criminal. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back to the anonymous message I'd received before coming home. There was no doubt now. Whoever sent it was trying to warn me. And maybe it was time to find out who they were, before things spiraled out of control. I left the house just before noon. The sky over Cedar Springs was a heavy gray, thick and still, just like my mood. I walked quickly down Main Street, a knit cap pulled over my head, my coat zipped up to my chin. The November cold bit at my face, but I welcomed it. At least it was more honest than the sweet, hollow words I'd heard in the living room that morning. My destination was a small coffee shop next to the town's post office, the same place I used to sit and write articles for the high school paper. It hadn't changed much, just the name, from Maple Bean to Spruce and Sip. The owner now was a young woman I didn't recognize, but my old seat by the window was still there. I sat down, ordered a cup of black tea, and opened my laptop. I began tracking down every lead I had, Reed Holdings projects, their subsidiaries, shell companies, registration addresses. The deeper I dug, the more twisted it became. Layers upon layers of dummy corporations registered in Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada. Some transactions were routed through offshore accounts in the British Virgin Islands. I switched over to local development projects. The Riverfront Plaza building, abandoned mid-construction. The lakeside property that had been pitched as a shopping center, now fenced off and untouched for 2 years. There were barely any signs of active construction. One article from 8 months ago in the Cedar Springs Ledger made me stop. A short piece in the Reader's Corner section, submitted by someone using the initials MH, questioned how Reed Holdings was raising capital for projects that hadn't received permits. It also mentioned unusually early interest payouts to internal investors. The article was never followed up. The paper changed ownership shortly after. I crossed my arms, trying to steady my breathing. The picture was starting to come together. My family wasn't just facing financial trouble. They were using new investor money to pay off older ones. This wasn't high-risk business. It was a Ponzi scheme. I picked up my phone and called the only person I trusted who could verify what I was thinking. Jason Cooper speaking. Still the same clip tone as always. We'd been in the same media law class our senior year of college, had dated briefly, but life had pulled us in different directions. Now he worked as a federal investigator for the Department of Justice, specializing in financial fraud. I need a meeting. Urgent. I said nothing else over the phone. Even though Jason was trustworthy, I couldn't be sure the line was secure. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a used bookstore in the next town over. I got back home around 3 p.m. The front gate was wide open, Eric's car parked right up by the steps. I walked in. No one greeted me. The air inside felt heavier than before. I could hear my father's voice coming from the study, sharp, tense, clearly arguing with someone on the phone. I went straight to my room. Just as I stepped inside, my phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. They're covering their tracks. Don't let them sign in your name. I froze. The text came from the same address as the earlier anonymous email. I opened my laptop and checked the trust fund monitoring system, a feature I'd requested years ago while briefly working at my old bank. One login attempt stood out from 2 days ago from an IP address in Connecticut. Exactly the day Brittany had called to say Dad had passed away. They'd tried to access the account. I printed the access logs and stuffed them into my bag. Just before 5 p.m., I arrived at the bookstore where I was meeting Jason. He was already there, seated in the back corner, one hand resting casually on a mystery novel, looking like any other reader. But his brown eyes hadn't changed, sharp, alert, always scanning. And now, Charlotte, he said with a nod as I sat down, start from the top. I told him everything in 30 minutes, leaving nothing out. The midnight call, the fake death, Bernard, the contract this morning, the financial leads. Jason didn't take notes, he just listened, but I could tell he was processing every detail, linking threads in his head. Based on what you've described, he said when I finished, I can confirm, at the very least, this points to investment fraud, mismanagement of trust funds, and if they've forged signatures, then that's a felony. I wasn't surprised, but hearing someone else say it still hurt. I need to know, I said. Are they already being investigated? Jason paused for a moment. Not officially. But there have been internal reports flagged by partner banks. Some suspicious activity, but no formal charges yet. The problem is, if you don't act fast, they could move everything offshore. And once that happens, it all drops into a very dangerous gray area. I nodded. I need evidence, he continued. Internal documents, recordings, anything that proves intent to defraud or manipulate the fund. I'm collecting it, I said. Piece by piece. Be careful, Charlotte. You're a threat to them now. And when family sees you as the only thing standing between them and millions of dollars, you know what they're capable of. I looked at Jason. No words needed. I knew better than anyone, because I'd already seen my father's eyes when he spoke about my signature. That wasn't the look of a father seeking reconciliation. It was the look of a man placing his final bet and willing to sacrifice anyone who stood in the way. That night, I returned home after dark. The lights in the dining room were still on, and I could hear quiet conversation drifting from the living room. The scent of roast meat lingered in the air, mixed with cinnamon from a candle on the table. Everything was arranged like a cozy family dinner, as if the past few days had been nothing more than a small misunderstanding, easily smoothed over with a few drinks and familiar food. I walked into the living room and saw they were all already there. My father in his usual seat, a glass of whiskey in hand. Eric near the fireplace, holding a glass of red wine. Brittany was sitting beside my mother in the armchair, both dressed in formal attire, their hair perfectly styled, as if they had just come from a society luncheon. You're home, my mother said, her eyes never leaving the tea she was gently stirring. No one asked where I'd been all day. No one mentioned Bernard, or the stack of paperwork that had been sitting on the table since morning. We're expecting guests tonight, my father said, his voice low, calm, with a forced air of warmth. They're close associates, people who understand the value of the Reed name. Just as he finished speaking, the doorbell rang. Brittany stood up quickly and went to answer it. 3 people entered, 2 men and 1 woman, all well-dressed, their expressions carefully measured to conceal their intentions. But when they shook hands with my father, I saw it clearly in their eyes. Scrutiny, thinly veiled impatience, the look of people who had put in money and were growing tired of waiting. Charlotte, let me introduce you, my father said. This is Mr. Haynes and Ms. Caldwell, representing the Farrow and Beck Investment Fund. And this is Mr. Russo, their financial advisor. I shook each hand with a polite smile. Mr. Russo's hand was cold and gripped too tightly. "We've heard a lot about you," Miss Caldwell said, her eyes lingering on the cuff of my sleeve. "We're very eager to hear your vision for Reed Innovations." I sat down across from the three of them. "I'm afraid I don't have a vision yet," I said bluntly. "I only learned about the entire project less than 3 days ago." A brief, tense silence passed. Miss Caldwell pursed her lips. My father gave a tight smile, raising his glass to break the mood. "Charlotte is modest," he said, "but she's sharp, and she's agreed to seriously consider joining the investment." I said nothing. "Excellent," Mr. Haynes nodded, "because if she's still hesitant, we may need to explore alternative solutions, and every solution comes with a cost." His tone was polite, but the message was unmistakably a warning. My father jumped in quickly. "Everything is progressing well. She just needs a little time to wrap things up in Chicago. We've agreed to finalize everything within 3 days." I turned to look at him. 3 days. The deadline had been set without my consent. "She won't disappoint," Brittany chimed in with a bright smile. "Charlotte is very committed to protecting the family's reputation." I smiled faintly, the kind of smile I wore in front of politicians I was about to expose. "Perhaps we should move to dinner," my mother suggested, rising to her feet. The group migrated to the dining room. Conversation shifted to safe, surface-level topics. Real estate trends in Atlanta, the post-pandemic office market, bank interest rates. I barely heard any of it. I sat there, knife and fork in hand, staring at the plate in front of me. Veal with mushroom sauce, my childhood favorite. My mother still remembered. She must have cooked it tonight as a gesture to tug at old memories. But all I felt was a tightness in my throat. I looked around the table, at the faces I once called family, once believed were mine. They were performing, every movement rehearsed. My father playing the commanding leader, Eric the calm support, Brittany the loyal sister. And me, I was their last card, the one piece they needed to keep the game from falling apart. At that moment, my phone vibrated once in my pocket. I pulled it out discreetly under the table, a message from an unknown number. "Don't sign. They've done this before. To your mother." I felt the blood drained from my face. My mind flashed back to my mother's sudden death in the middle of the night, announced by a single email from a lawyer stating she had died of a heart attack. No pre-existing conditions, no further inquiry, no one questioned it. I looked up and met my father's eyes from across the table. There was no sadness there, no concern. Only complete confidence. As if he thought he'd already won. I smiled, slowly, softly. In my mind, the final missing pieces began sliding into place, and I knew this wasn't going to be their game anymore. After dinner, once the guests had gone and the house returned to its usual artificial quiet, I slipped back to my room. As soon as the door clicked shut behind me, I pulled out my phone and reread the message. "Don't sign. They've done this before. To your mother." I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, my fingers trembling as I opened the folder containing my mother's digital medical records, the ones I had quietly requested from her old hospital years ago, but never had the courage to examine in detail. On the screen, clinical terminology stacked like dry bricks. But one small line made me freeze. Cardiac stimulant not administered due to known allergy on file. My mother was allergic to digoxin, I knew that. She had once been hospitalized for an anaphylactic reaction to that exact medication. Her doctor knew, so why in this report was digoxin still administered? And why was there no follow-up? My throat was dry. In this house, how many truths had been buried? And who was trying to help me uncover them? My phone vibrated again, same number. "If you want proof, go to the old Reed Builders warehouse at 11 p.m. Come alone." I checked the time. 10:18. I didn't have long to decide. I changed into a jacket, slipped on shoes with soft soles, then quietly opened the window at the back of my room. I climbed out onto the roof just like I used to do back in high school. Back then, it was to sneak out to parties. Now I was leaving this house like someone chasing the truth through shadows. The old warehouse was about a 15-minute walk, past a line of trees leading toward the abandoned industrial zone. Since Reed Builders had merged into the parent company, the place had been left to rot, just another dusty entry in the town's development records. I arrived on time. The door was locked, but someone had looped a hook latch on the outside. Easy to slip open. I stepped in, the flashlight on my phone lighting a narrow path through piles of dust-covered lumber and metal. There was a sound. I held my breath. Then a figure emerged from behind a stack of wooden file cabinets. An older woman, silver hair neatly pinned back. It took me a few seconds to recognize her. Evelyn Monroe. She had been the company's chief accountant, retired abruptly 2 years ago without explanation. I remembered clearly. People said she'd had a mild stroke and couldn't continue working, but in her eyes now, there was no fog of age, only exhaustion and bitterness. "You didn't expect it was me sending those messages, did you?" Evelyn asked, her voice rough, like someone who hadn't spoken freely in a long time. "I didn't know who to trust," I whispered. "I didn't either once," she replied, then handed me a small black USB drive. Inside is a copy of internal accounting reports, overseas wire transfers, and, most importantly, a full analysis of your mother's death. I originally submitted it to Bernard, but he never presented it to the board. They silenced me with a retirement settlement I never touched. I held the USB in my hand. My eyes burned. "Why are you helping me?" Because of your mother." Evelyn looked up and met my gaze. She came to my office a week before she died. She knew something was wrong, but no one would listen. I still remember the look on her face when she left. It's the same look you have now. I swallowed hard. There were no words left to say. Evelyn placed her hand gently over mine. "You're smart, Charlotte, but don't think being smart is enough. They've got people on the inside, at the bank board, in the notary office. If you want to bring them down, you have to do it right, and fast." I nodded, slipping the USB into the inner pocket of my coat. "I have Jason Cooper," I said quietly. "He's helping me, and I won't back down." "Then you need to leave now," Evelyn said, her eyes briefly flashing with worry. "I suspect they're monitoring junk email traffic. If Bernard finds out you got the evidence, they'll act." I stepped out of the warehouse. The night wind hit my face like a slap, as if it was reminding me to stay sharp. The tremble in my chest wasn't fear, it was fury. For my mother, for Evelyn, for myself, and for everyone else they dragged into the dark just to preserve the hollow thing they called a legacy. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind wouldn't stop moving. Evelyn's words echoed in my head like a long-forgotten, sorrowful tune. Around 4 a.m., I got up, opened my laptop, and began backing up the contents of the USB onto 3 separate hard drives. Then, I encrypted everything with 2 layers of private passwords. As the sun rose over the eastern treetops, I was ready. Copies of the files, a summary of suspicious transactions, images of forged signatures on trust documents, and transfer statements to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, all provided by Evelyn. I knew I held in my hands what my family had been trying to bury for almost 3 years. I drove to the next town over and met Jason in a quiet parking lot behind the old supermarket. He sat in his car, sunglasses on, coat collar turned up like he was preparing for a covert briefing. I didn't speak. I just handed him the hard drive and a thick file of printed documents. "We've got enough to move," Jason said after flipping through the pages. "The question's no longer if, it's when and how." I nodded. "They're planning the formal signing tomorrow afternoon. My father's already scheduled Bernard, invited legal counsel, and the investors to the house. They think I've given in." "Perfect," Jason replied. "I'll coordinate with the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force and the State Justice Department. But I'll need a clear signal from you, right before they sign." "I'll say something very specific," I whispered, eyes on the windshield. "I think we should review everything, from the beginning." Jason chuckled softly, but his gaze never left mine. "Charlotte, when you say that, There's no turning back. Are you sure? I looked him straight in the eye. I'm not the girl who left this house on a bus with a torn suitcase and a blanket bag. I'm the last one in this family who still has a conscience. If I don't act, the people they've hurt will never see justice. We parted quickly. I returned to Cedar Springs just as the clock struck 8 a.m. The house was already bustling with activity. Brittany calling the florist, my mother bustling in and out of the kitchen like an overwhelmed hostess, and Eric walking beside my father, speaking in low, firm tones. I stepped into the dining room. It had been cleared out and transformed into a reception space. A long table stood in the center, covered in a white linen cloth, with a vase of pristine white orchids placed carefully in the middle. On the table were brand new fountain pens filled with blue ink set beside neatly bound, pre-stamped folders. They'd prepared everything for the so-called final signing. "Did you sleep well?" my mother asked, fastening the buttons on her blouse. "Fine, Mom," I replied, forcing a natural tone. "Good. Today is an important day," she said, leaning in to whisper. "Thank you for thinking this through. Family is what matters most." I smiled, a smile that, to an outsider, might have looked touched. But inside, every vein in my body was tensed. By late morning, Bernard arrived, dressed in a dark suit, carrying his usual leather briefcase. His polite smile hadn't changed, but I no longer found it pleasant. "Charlotte," he greeted me with a nod. "I'm very glad you're ready." I nodded slightly. "I just want to review everything to be sure I understand." Of course," he replied, unable to hide his satisfaction. They thought I was convinced. They believed a few heartfelt words in a childhood dish were enough to make me forget the truth. But they had forgotten. I was no longer the girl who used to hide behind a bedroom door, clutching a stuffed bear while her parents fought, praying for a miracle. Now I was the one holding all the evidence. By 1:30 p.m., the guests began to arrive. Not just investment reps, but a few unfamiliar figures. Men in polished leather shoes and shiny watches, with eyes sharp as blades. One silver-hailed man named Marchesi shook my father's hand with excessive familiarity. "Their representative," Brittany whispered to me. "He's the one who helped us escape the Arizona project." A chill ran down my spine. Escape, a word you never use in legitimate business. For the next few hours, I played the obedient daughter, nodded at the right moments, smiled just enough, gave brief, neutral answers. They were all pleased. Everyone laughed. My mother whispered with investors' wives about a luxury spa planned for the lakeside. Eric poured wine like he hadn't screamed at me during our last fight years ago. At 4 p.m., Bernard began his speech. He spoke of trust, of the future, of Charlotte Reed's return as proof that blood always finds its way home. I sat still, listening to him paint a bright picture like we were launching an IPO. Then it was time for me to sign. I placed my hand on the folder, flipped to the first page, and looked at the familiar lines of legal text. Then I took a deep breath, lifted my head, and looked Bernard straight in the eye. "Before I sign," I said slowly, "I think we should review everything, from the beginning." The room froze. Silence fell like someone had flipped off the sound of the entire world. And that was the moment everything began to shift toward a direction they never saw coming. The moment I finished my sentence, every glass on the table seemed to stop vibrating. My father's smile froze in place. Bernard leaned slightly forward, trying to maintain composure, but I saw clearly how tightly he was gripping the documents, as if the slightest pressure would tear the pages apart. "Charlotte, is there something you'd like to clarify?" he asked, his voice hoarse like a man who had just swallowed a curse. I opened the folder, flipped through the pages slowly, then stopped at the clause about the trust fund asset transfer. I pointed at the small print near the bottom. "This line," I said calmly, "states that once I sign, I become a non-voting shareholder and all decisions regarding asset adjustments will be made solely by the board. That means I lose all control." No one answered. Eyes shifted between me and the paperwork. Bernard cleared his throat, about to respond, but before he could speak, the living room doors burst open. A group of individuals in suits stepped in, led by a woman with neatly tied brown hair, holding a folder marked with the FBI seal. Jason walked right behind her, his expression serious, but with a trace of relief in his eyes. "Charles Reed," the woman said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I'm Special Agent Anna Crawley. We have a federal warrant to search and seize all financial records related to Reed Holdings, Reed Innovations, and affiliated entities. Please remain seated and comply." The room erupted into chaos. Bernard shot to his feet, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. My mother gasped. Eric spun around, eyes wild. Brittany turned pale, gripping the arm of her chair as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. But my father, he didn't move. His face flushed, then went ghostly white. He stared at me like he'd just seen a ghost rise from the grave. "What have you done?" he growled, his voice low and thunderous. I stood, meeting his gaze. "I'm doing what Grandpa always wanted, protecting this legacy from being turned into a tool for lies, manipulation, and evasion." "You betrayed your blood," he roared. "You'll regret this day." "No," I said, not breaking eye contact. "What I regret is staying silent for far too long." Jason stepped forward and handed the agents the reference files. One agent opened a laptop and inserted the USB I had given him that morning. Numbers, cash flows, and foreign account addresses lit up on the screen. Each file cut through the family's glamorous facade like a scalpel. Bernard tried to pull out his phone. A federal agent quickly grabbed his wrists and confiscated the device. "You'll be questioned separately. Do not attempt to destroy evidence," the agent said, then turned to me. "Thank you, Charlotte. You've done something very few have the courage to do." I nodded, lips pressed tight, trying to hold down the shaking in my chest. The sound of handcuffs was alien. Eric was taken first, his head lowered, silent. Bernard followed, muttering under his breath as he was escorted out. My mother slumped over the table, face buried in her hands. Her hair still neatly styled, but her expression shattered, stripped of the poise that once anchored every high society party. My father was the last to be taken. When two agents touched his shoulders, he turned to look at me one more time. "I built all of this for the honor of this family, and you're the one who destroyed it." I didn't look away. "No, Dad, you did that a long time ago. I just stopped you from dragging others down with you." He stared at me for another few seconds, then turned away, rigid, offering no resistance. That's when Brittany sprang up and rushed toward me, eyes red and teary. "You can't do this. You were supposed to protect us. We're family." We stepped back half a pace. "If you saw me as family, you wouldn't have lured me back with a fake death. You wouldn't have helped them build all these lies." "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, collapsing into the chair, covering her face with both hands. My chest tightened, but I stayed on my feet. The house fell silent again. The agents began collecting files, removing hard drives, sealing records, labeling envelopes. I stood among white flowers, crisp linens, and neatly arranged fountain pens, all set for a ceremonial asset transfer. Only now, instead of transferring wealth, we were recovering the truth. And for the first time in years, I could feel my grandfather smiling in memory. A sad but understanding smile. The following weeks passed like a slow-burning storm. No more explosions, no more screaming, no threats. But still, my heart felt heavy, like I was walking through the ashes of something long burned. The FBI, the State Justice Department, and the Securities and Exchange Commission rotated in and out. I sat through more than 10 interviews, answered hundreds of questions about documents, meetings, and family dynamics. Jason was always there, one seat away, quiet but constant. I never felt alone. The day my father was officially indicted, I received a package at the attorney's office. Inside was my grandfather's old pocket watch, the back engraved in cursive, "Integrity lasts longer than legacy." No note, no sender. I held the watch for a long time. It felt like I was holding part of his soul. The only one who ever believed in me, in a family that only trusted numbers and power. When the final sentencing hearing came, I didn't sit beside the prosecutor or in the front row. I chose a seat near the back of the courtroom, hidden among witnesses, journalists, and local residents who had once invested in Reed Holdings. My father appeared in a pale orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, eyes forward, never glancing my way. Eric sat beside his private attorney, noticeably thinner, hair graying rapidly. Brittany was out on bail, awaiting her separate sentencing after agreeing to cooperate. My mother wasn't there. She had filed for transfer to a senior correctional facility due to health reasons. When the judge read the verdict, the room fell silent. Each charge landed like a chisel: investment fraud, money laundering, trust abuse, document forgery. My father was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison with no parole for the first 12. Eric received 11 years. Bernard lost his license permanently and got 6 years behind bars. Brittany, after surrendering all hidden assets and information, received 14 months of house arrest, combined with community service and psychological counseling. When court adjourned, I walked out without looking at anyone, without saying a word. There was no feeling of victory. Only a void and a sorrow I couldn't name. I spent the following months finalizing the restitution fund. With Jason's help, attorney James Sullivan, and especially Evelyn Monroe, I created the Reclaim Foundation. From the portion of my inheritance still untouched, funds no one in my family could access, I contributed nearly $3 million to repay the victims who had invested in those ghost projects. Every meeting with the victims left a lump in my throat. An elderly couple who had sold their home to invest in a housing project that was never completed. A retired teacher who lost her entire pension. A young man who had just opened a coffee shop, tricked into investing in a shopping center that never existed. I looked into their eyes and apologized, even though I wasn't the one who took their money. But I knew that if I didn't stand up, no one would ever return anything to them. Each payment from the fund came with a handwritten letter. In it, I wrote, "This is not my redemption. This is an acknowledgement that you were betrayed, and you deserve to be seen." Soon, the responses came: handwritten cards, quiet hugs at the office, letters from people I had never met. And then one day, Brittany came to find me. She stood at the entrance of the foundation's office, holding a file folder, hair cut short, face bare. She didn't look anything like the girl who once graced the cover of the local financial magazine with a movie star smile. I motioned for her to come in. We sat across from each other in silence for several minutes. "I'm not here to say sorry," Brittany said quietly, "because I know an apology won't change anything. But I'm learning how to live without hurting people. There's a support group for former inmates in the next state. I'm working there as a counselor now." I didn't answer right away. I just nodded. "And," she opened the folder and took out a handwritten letter, "I found this while cleaning out Mom's old desk. It's a letter she wrote to you but never sent." I took it. I knew the handwriting. Folded in half, the edges yellowed with age. I read it in silence, my eyes burning. In the letter, my mother wrote about the doubts she once had but never had the courage to confront, the dreams she never got to live, and the shame she felt when she realized she had turned her daughter into a thorn in her husband's side, just for daring to be herself. "You don't have to forgive me," Brittany said before she left. "I just hope one day, when you look at me, you won't see his face." I sat there for a long time after, watching my little sister walk away from the office and into the fading light of the evening. At the end of autumn, I returned to Chicago. My small 14th floor apartment was exactly as I'd left it, except for the houseplants, wilted and dry from weeks without water. I tended to them one by one, the same way I was relearning how to love the life I had nearly lost to the storms of my past. One afternoon, Jason stopped by, carrying a large envelope. "Good news," he said, settling into the armchair. "The court approved the expansion application for Reclaim Foundation into neighboring counties, and there are several organizations interested in partnering." I nodded. "Good. There are still so many people who need help." Jason looked at me for a moment, then gently placed his hand over mine. "Charlotte, you might not see yourself as a hero, but to many people, you've become their last hope." I didn't reply, I just gave his hand a small squeeze, like a silent promise that I was still here, still moving forward, not for the past, but for what's right, for what's still waiting to be made whole. What would you do if one day the people who were supposed to love and protect you turned out to be the first ones willing to sacrifice you for their own gain? Would you forgive them, or would you rise and fight to defend what little good was left? My name is Charlotte Reed, and this is my true story. But I know I'm not alone. Somewhere out there, there are others like me, carrying wounds from the very roof they once believed was their safest place. Tell me your thoughts on this story. Have you been through something similar? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Don't forget to follow the channel for more real-life stories about family, truth, and courage, because sometimes the most painful endings are where freedom finally begins.